Hi all, Dr. Clark here again. Today for Natural Resource, we're going to start talking about food and nutrition. And this is of interest to a lot of people because um, things have changed. There's a lot of controversy around food, nutrition. Most Americans are at least some point in their life uh, are subjected to dieting. So there's a lot of situations where food and nutrition are very important. And we're going to look at it from a world perspective. So I'm going to bounce around like other lectures from developed countries, so United States, Europe, Japan, China, to developing countries, most of Africa, South America, parts of India or Southern Asian continent, and so we're going to look at nutrition from both perspectives. Okay, so starting out, most of you are probably fairly familiar with the simple food pyramid thing where it tells you how many servings of grains you should have. So bread, cereal, rice, and pasta, you should have 6 to 11. Fruits you should have 2 to 4. Vegetables should have 3 to 5. And milk and yogurt 2 to 3. And meats or poultry, fish, nuts, those kind of things, 2 to 3 servings. Um, and then other things like fats and sweets and oils you should use very little of. That's the old school food pyramid that at least probably most of the students watching this, you probably got this in elementary school when you're coming up. We're going to look at a new food pyramid that was created by Harvard, and we're going to see how it's a little bit different, but that's a little bit later on. All right, so let's dive into food and nutrition though. Now, the one thing that we can say is I've talked about a little bit before about kind of what's going on in the world today and with pollution, climate change, natural resources, those kind of things, diseases, other things. And we haven't been doing a very good job with much on any of those fronts for that matter. But what we have been doing a fairly good job on is providing food, at least some type of food. And so the world food supply has actually kept up or even surpassed the population growth of the world, which is really good news because that means that less people are dying of hunger. Right? So if you look, during the past 40 years, the population growth has been about 1.7% per year, and the food production has been about 2.2%. So we're keeping up with the population. This is really good news. But there's some problem with this news is that there's still chronic hunger. Okay? Now, if we look at 1960, 60% of the population of developing countries was considered chronically undernourished. So if we look at in 1960, we could just say, well, the world's population in 1960 was a little bit over 3 billion. So we can just say that it was 3 billion. And then let's just say that half of the 3 billion people, which is probably a little more than half, but let's say half of the 3 billion people were in developing countries and half were in developed countries. So from that standpoint, you're looking at about 900 million people were chronically undernourished in 1960. Today, the chronically undernourished population is about 16% in the world. Well, 16% of 7.7 billion is right around a little over 600 million people. So yeah, we've improved. I mean, we have 300 million less people, almost the entire United States, less people that are chronically undernourished in the world. But we still have hundreds of millions of people that are chronically undernourished. And we're going to look at um, some ways in the next few lectures that we might be able to reverse this. So where does the chronic undernourishment come from? Normally it's coming from poverty, and that shouldn't be a big surprise to you. If you're poor and you can't support yourself by purchasing food, you're probably eating very limited food resources. So maybe the same thing that's grown by the family or by a neighbor or by the village, the same thing every day. So mainly this would be a lack of protein almost always. So poverty is a big player in this. So this can happen in many situations, okay, at many different levels. Um, but this can be due to the poverty or due to the food security can be due to natural systems. Okay, so in a lot of um, regions, the food availability is cyclic. So maybe you have lots of food available to you in maybe the spring and early summer, but as you progress, maybe there's less food, or maybe there's plenty of food spring, summer, and fall, but winter there's very little food. So you can have a seasonal effect, but you can also have other effects like political effects or social system effects, where maybe the working class or the poor people, their rations, the amount of food they get, is very different than the wealthy people, and that's almost always the case. Um, and so it can happen at many different levels. In some cases, it's just an environmental effect. In other cases, it could be like a political, governmental effect. What we have figured out, just like we figured out with birth rates and disease outbreaks, um, is education is very, very important. And it's not educating the men so much as it is the women. A lot of men will get education no matter what in most countries. But women in a lot of countries are either forbidden to get education, or they're just not allowed, or they're not provided that resource of education. But when we do provide the resource, we see that in most situations, the amount of chronically undernourished goes way down, the amount of food security goes way up, and that's because we're teaching the individuals who are typically the farmers, that would be the females, are the ones that are raising grains and things like that. Remember, in most areas where villages or individuals are supporting themselves via food, and there's no grocery stores, those kind of things. The men are hunters, or the men are actually working for the family to provide financial gains, money, in many situations. So the women are left to tend to the farms and grow vegetables and things like that. And we actually see that, they have a much better production, a much better farm, okay? And it's a huge step in getting food security in a lot of countries. Now, these are developing countries that we're talking about. But there is also a situation going on in developed countries, okay, which we'll get to. So here's the hunger atlas of the world. So in yellow is less than 5% of the people are considered to be either undernourished or have true hunger. So you can see United States, Canada, Europe, uh, some parts of South America, although this is changing if you know much about the world news. Australia, um, you see this less than 5% of those populations are undernourished or have severe hunger. You see that most of the hunger issues come in Africa and parts of Asia, with some quite a few countries having greater than 35% of their people are either undernourished, okay, and with that goes hunger. Now, a lot of times those situations can cause famines, and where there's mass outbreak of undernourishment and hunger, and these there's a lot of situations that can um, increase famines, and we see them all over the world when hurricanes hit, tsunamis hit, large infestations of insects. These can all add to the severity of a famine, but most of the time famines are due to social issues or political issues. Right? So war outbreaks or new government situations, that's where you get large-scale food shortages or mass starvation events. Right? So we often see with these famines, with these food shortages, you see very large migrations, which should make sense um, from a animal perspective. I mean, you can think of this from the perspective of any animal you know about. If that animal is in the grasslands and there's no grass, so maybe there was a fire outbreak and all the grass is gone, those animals are not going to stay there, which makes sense. They're going to migrate, and they're going to migrate in huge numbers to a new region to hopefully find food. And we see that mass migration in people also. And it's really a travesty, because a lot of times what we do is during those mass migrations, we'll get them, I should say, developed countries will provide them resources, but they provide them resources in camps. So we stick all of them into one big camp or one big area, and we provide them resources. And we think that's doing a great job, but in actuality, normally what it's doing is it's increasing the amount of disease spread, increasing the amount of um, angst and stress on the individuals. Now, like I said before, environmental conditions can definitely trigger famines. Okay, you got drought, you got hurricanes, these kind of things. But normally, a famine is not the direct result of an environmental condition. It's the result of political or social breakdown in dealing with those environmental conditions. And a lot of the famines that we see currently today in places, in countries in Africa, are due to armed conflict around either resources, water, these kind of things. And you can get these huge deals where politically the government is withholding food, or they increase the price so much that no one could ever purchase the food. Sometimes they cause all the food to rot on purpose and never supply the people with food just to show a political point. There's lots of ways at which famines can be increased by social and government of many different countries. Okay? So we're going to watch a quick little video about possible ways in which we can decrease the severity of famines when they occur. 'Cause, 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 'cause Okay, so there you can see a education program and a program that's really started from the UK and the World Health Organization to provide education to farmers in regions of Africa where they've been growing certain crops or they've been farming in a certain way that is it's an old method, and new methods, especially in times of drought or times of environmental condition change, new methods need to be applied. So we have a lot of researchers that will come in and teach these individuals how to grow food under different conditions. Maybe a better method of growing food, maybe a better method of utilizing irrigation and water when drought periods are upon that country or that region. This has allowed a lot of freedom for individuals because now they're not having to wait for food trucks, or they're not having to wait for the handout necessarily. Now there is a cash kind of incentive there where these organizations are giving them cash to basically go back to school and learn these techniques and to better the region. You have to give them some incentive, maybe not that kind of incentive, but you have to give them a means to live while they are learning these new techniques, and that's kind of the idea around these programs. So instead of just dropping off rice and other food material for these regions during drought periods and things like that, instead what's going on is these organizations are training people how to survive better than what they would if we were just dropping food at their doorstep. And it's better anyways, because normally the food that we drop at their doorstep is not their native diet. And so that can cause some major issues when you're dropping off rice, but these populations never actually eat rice except for when you get famines and drought periods, and now they got to change their diet and eat rice, which can cause a lot of health issues for a lot of these individuals. So there are some programs out there to try to mitigate and to try to help with the food shortages, especially during environmental change or environmental condition change that can cause famines. So, like I said before, famines, I mean, they're big news, and people want to get their hands um, dirty to help out countries that are subjected to a famine. And a lot of countries, United States included, we always are thinking about, hey, let's send them resources, let's help them out. And this is great. This is really what we should do as humanitarians. We should be helping these people out, especially the rich countries should be helping out these people so we don't have massive starvation events and people dying and uh, huge riots and political backlash, because you never know when, as a rich country, you might not be that rich anymore. Look at some of the South American countries that are going through some major changes. Now that generosity really is counterproductive a lot of times, because you're feeding individuals in camps, you're herding people together, which can spread diseases. You can also make them walk a long ways, especially if the famine has been triggered by a war zone. I mean, no one wants to have food camps and things like that inside an active war zone. So a lot of times, United States and European Union, European nations, etc., will set up food camps outside the region, outside the war zone, and make individuals travel to them, which can be a huge problem and can also result in a lot more violence on these people. Now, those are what we call developing country issues. But we also have a developed country issue, and the United States is by far the biggest issue in the United States, or the biggest overeating problem comes with the United States, but Europe has this problem, Japan, China, regions where we consider Canada, where we consider the populations being developed or the country being developed. So I'm going to present mostly United States data because it's a lot easier to come by and it's a lot more severe than some of the other countries. But in the United States, because we eat a lot of energetically rich foods, right, that might be rich in sugar, it might be rich in fat, but really it's just rich in calories. We have a major issue with people being overweight and even more so being obese. So right now, as of 2018, 64% of Americans are overweight and 33% of Americans are considered obese, which means that they are 20% or more overweight than their ideal weight, or they have a mass body index that's greater than 30 kilograms per meter squared. This is a big deal. I mean, if you think about that, 33%, so 1 out of every 3 people is considered obese. Or, far more than 50%, 64% of Americans are considered overweight. This contributes to the health issues that we see, and also can contribute, though, when we start looking at food production. Do we really need that much food production? And look, next time you go to a restaurant, look at how much waste we create. Next time you're even cooking a dinner, look at how much food is thrown away. We not only have an overeating problem in the United States, we have an overproduction problem in some types of food, and then we have an overwaste problem. So like we said before when we were talking about diseases and leading causes of death, being overweight increases your likelihood, increases your chances of diabetes. We already know that one out of every 3 children today will have diabetes, will produce diabetes, will become diabetic before they die. So 1 out of every 3 children, 33% of Americans will become diabetic. And I'm sure that you know lots of children that are diabetic. Heart attack. It's going to be the leading cause of death, probably in the world, but it is currently the leading cause of death in the United States. Strokes, also up there with causes of death. We have cancer, that is number 2 on the list for causes of death. And we already know that there is a direct link to being overweight and producing cancer, because there's a lot of connections. First of all, the more you eat, the more cells you have to produce. The more cells you have to produce, the higher the rate of mutation that you could subject yourself to. So that's one piece. But on top of that, the more you consume and the greater your mass is, the less exercise you get, probably the more processed foods you're eating. Now, there's not a direct connection from processed food to cancer, but there is some preliminary results that suggest that there's a link between the two. So there's all kinds of situations that are going on. So in the United States, we probably really need to have not just a diet change and a lifestyle change. We need a production change. We need to stop overproducing, because with stopping overproduction, then we can probably stop overeating, and we might be able to even stop the overproduction of waste products. And we'll come back and we'll talk about some of this as we progress into the amount of waste that we create here in the United States, which is ridiculous, but we'll get to it. So it might go back to just simple education. Now I know that when we're talking about the United States, we also need to talk about productivity level of the United States. So the United States, when it comes to job productivity, we're higher than most nations when it comes to job productivity, and that's because we work really hard and very long hours. It's rare that anyone puts in 40 hours a week. It's normally more than that. The only one that's probably got us beat, well, two main countries, is Japan and China. But Europe rarely has situations like that. If they work a 40-hour week, it's 40 hours, not working more than that. So a lot of our food choices come with convenience, and that's either packaged foods, fast food restaurants, these kind of things, which rarely will have the nutrition, the good nutrition value that you would want from your food. Now, we look at Americans, majority of Americans, consume way too much protein, first of all. Now, I know some of you probably, even very fit individuals who lift weights a lot and are bodybuilders, eat a ton of protein. Now, that's extremely bad for you. It creates a burden on your kidneys, because every time you break down protein, you have to break down the nitrogen and the amino acid, and that increases the processing that your kidneys have to do, which can cause major damage, major kidney damage. But apart from that, we also eat way too much simple sugar, too many carbohydrates, whether that comes in simple sugars like glucose, dextrose, sucrose, these kind of things. These are just simple sugars. We also eat too much starchy food, so these are large complex carbohydrates. So we eat too many potatoes and too much bread, too much pasta, these kind of things. So it's a combination. Very rarely would you ever have a meal where you don't have a protein source, or a couple protein sources, or too much protein. You don't have some kind of simple sugar with it, and you don't have some kind of starch with it. And normally it's more than a normal individual could consume, or should consume, I should say. We can consume. So researchers at Harvard have recommended a new dietary pyramid, a new way to reduce the amount of red meat that we eat and protein that we eat, to reduce how much starch we're taking in, and emphasize the whole grains and fruits and things like that. So I'll show you the pyramid in just a second, but here's one of the key things that the pyramid has changed also. The bottom layer of the pyramid is not something that you do from a diet standpoint, but something that you do from an activity standpoint. And so the bottom part of the pyramid is now exercise. So if you see here, the new Harvard food pyramid is gearing towards exercise first, then consume fruits and vegetables, whole grains, even some healthy fats. But there's no longer a number of servings at these lower levels. Even the fish and poultry and eggs, okay, and the nuts and seeds, there's no longer serving sizes. It's not until you get into the milk and the cheeses, the dairies, where you see 1 to 2 serving sizes or servings per day. Okay? These guys, it's not a matter that you can eat as much as you want, but it's rather based on your exercise. How many calories are you burning? So how much caloric need do you have? If you're a normal sized individual, maybe you're going with the 2,000 calories a diet. Well, if you're burning 1,000 calories and you want to maintain normal body function and normal body size, and you burn 1,000 calories a day, well, then you can eat 3,000 calories in food, because your normal body needs about 2,000 calories. Now, if you're a really small, petite individual, maybe you only need 1,500 calories per day. Right? But you can see at the very top of the list, you can see a soda on there. You know, sugary drinks and sweets, you should use them sparingly. Red meat, butters, and refined grains. So this is where a lot of the food pyramids change over time. We knew back in the 80s when that original food pyramid was produced, we know the benefits of whole grains. We did at the time. But normally we just say grains and we just list them. Well, people eating, things like white rice or white bread, they'd be like, well, I'm getting my grains, and that's not true. White bread, for example, it only uses one part of the grain of wheat, and it uses a part of the grain of wheat that is high in sugar and very, very low in vitamins and low in essential nutrients. And so you're missing out on a lot of the nutrients that you would normally have. And so Harvard has split this off into their pyramid. So you can see a little bit of difference there. All right, so with that, we're going to talk more about nutrition and kind of the lack of nutrition, what happens when you're missing simple things like iodine. That element, what happens to a human's body when that's missing from their diet? Or what if you don't have enough protein in your diet? What are the diseases that originate from these kind of lack of nutrients inside your diet? We're going to talk about that next time.